So this is Final Fantasy V. You know, this is one of the ones in the franchise that I don't hear get talked about as much. But this is the first time I'm playing it, and this is a really interesting way to start the game, to throw you right into the world from the beginning. Although it seems like I'm supposed to, walk to this meteor over here. But isn't it kind of strange that Final Fantasy IV ended up being the shortest one in the series? You know, it's almost like the game was so ambitious for the hardware at the time that it couldn't be longer. You know? I started the franchise by playing the newer ones, and 13 was the longest, 13 was the shortest one that I played out of those. And that clocked in at about 40 hours. So, when I went and I played Final Fantasy IV and it clocked in at like 20, I was like, wow, And keep in mind, this is after I'd played the first one, and it clocked in at like 50. About 5 years ago, I decided that I was going to start playing catch-up. You might be thinking, on what? Well, everything, pretty much. The things from before I was born. The things from before my parents and grandparents were born. The things from when I was growing up, but I was decidedly too young for them. It's like I consume all this crap, and I have so many thoughts about it, about books, about movies, about games, about TV shows, comics, all of it, And most of the time, I guess I just end up talking to myself. Let's talk about Final Fantasy. It's one of the most prolific and longest-running franchises in gaming history, with 15 main installments and dozens or maybe even hundreds of prequels, sequels, spin-offs, pocket editions, rhythm games, what have you. It regularly made huge revolutionary strides in the field of the RPG genre. It's universally loved by millions. It's got one of the best soundtracks ever, and it's still going strong today. Now, see, my entry into the franchise was both typical and atypical, I imagine, for somebody of my age, because I first got into it via Kingdom Hearts, which originally was like a sibling franchise to Final Fantasy, but is now more like an extended Disney commercial, which we're not going to get into that right now. At any rate, as a kid, I noticed that most of the Final Fantasy characters in the game hailed from 7, so naturally I thought to myself, okay, that's the one I'll start with. At the time, I wasn't aware that many people thought of 7 as one of the best, if not the best, RPGs of all time, but I picked it up on PSP nonetheless. Funny enough, my first technical Final Fantasy game was actually Crisis Core, which I noticed randomly at GameStop, saw the subheading Final Fantasy VII, and bought it just based off of that. It was jarring when I finally played the actual 7, how different it was, but I still loved Crisis Core, which was tied to Birth by Sleep in an interesting way. And I always thought that even though that was just one cameo, one character, it was so perfect and so well done, because both games were on the PSP, both games were prequels, and the Crisis Core main theme even made it into Birth by Sleep.
We gotta celebrate!
Huh? That won't really be necessary.
Hey, how about one date?
So I thought of it as more than enough. So it went Crisis Core, then Final Fantasy VII, and then Final Fantasy XIII, which was the first game in the franchise I actually beat, and catches far too much flack in my humble opinion. We'll talk about that one eventually too. The next game I played after that one, Dissidia 012. Yeah. So, yeah, I had both the standard entry into the franchise and a decidedly strange one. But, it's been about 8 years. I've mostly caught up on the franchise, which brings us to the topic of today, the long-awaited Final Fantasy VII Remake. Going into this game, I had no idea what to expect, because I'm not a person who watches reviews or gameplay trailers or anything like that. But boy, oh boy, did I get some surprises. Let's talk a little bit about Square's propensity to experiment in their Final Fantasy games. This is actually one of my favorite things about the franchise. The thing that often throws people off about the series is the misunderstanding of how it is a series. Story-wise, the games are not linked. Well, there's rumors that say that they are, but there's no hard proof yet. But each story takes place in its own universe, with its own rules about magic and monsters and the relationships between them, as well as varying degrees of fusion between fantasy and science fiction, or, as in Final Fantasy XV, reality. Monsters, weapons, some character names, and pieces of music. Carry over between games. But these are more Easter eggs than anything else, and you can play these games in whatever order you want. Each game's combat system pushes things in new directions. For many years, the mainstay was the first incarnation of the active time battle system, which took traditional turn-based RPG combat and added an element of real-time decision. This would become the dominant form of combat in the series for a while. But even within this system, games experimented with progression. Final Fantasy VII's materia system essentially made abilities individual items that could be swapped between party members and leveled up, while 9 linked abilities to certain pieces of equipment and allowed party members to learn them permanently. 12 pushed real-time further, while 13 overlaid the active time battle system onto what was almost like an elaborate chess match. It wasn't until 15 that the series would go into full-on real-time combat. Final Fantasy VII Remake is this crazy blend of all of the above. There's real-time elements, hack, dodge, block, but then once you open the menu, ATB comes into play and the game turns into a strategic thing. And in this game, hacking will not be enough. You gotta actually think about what you're gonna do to expose an enemy. Of all Square's various combinations of real-time and turn-based strategy over the years, this one might actually be my favorite. Here's another thing to address: the linearity. People complained a lot about this with Final Fantasy XIII, and we're going to discuss this more in another episode, but it's something that we should at least open the dialogue about right now. People frequently complain about linearity in big games nowadays. I know that at this point, it's par for the course to have these huge, sprawling worlds where you can go anywhere and there's a million objectives and the story is all but optional, but I don't think it always needs to be like that. In fact, I was playing Ghost of Tsushima the other day, and I was thinking about how similar a lot of these AAA games have become design-wise. How many of the open-world titles that you've played on the PS4 in the past little bit had a tabbed main menu, hella optional objectives, a mix of stealth, melee, and shooting for combat, a skill tree, and a huge open world? That's not to say those games aren't good, because they are, they're awesome. But it is to say that linearity isn't such a bad thing as people try to make it out to be. For one thing, it's a welcome change of pace, and for another, it lets you tell a stronger story. I know that for me, staying engaged in the story in those massive open worlds is a difficult thing a lot of the time. I think Horizon did it the best for me, because the story in that game was straight up fascinating, and even in that game when I first played it, I was overwhelmed. All the side quests, collectibles, unexplored towns and landscapes, not to mention crazy creatures roaming around waiting to be fought. I forgot about the story entirely sometimes.
So that Hades could whisper to them and call them from their grave.
But a linear game definitely lets you tell a more straightforward, moving narrative. The designers are more in control of the pacing, and so the story proceeds in a more deliberate fashion, and that's appreciated. Besides, for Final Fantasy to use a middle ground between completely open and totally linear is actually standard for the franchise. Before we get real heavy into the music in this game, I want to take a minute just to gush about this remake and how good it is, how well done it is. Honestly, I do. I really do. Because this remake is a big deal. You know, this remake is one of those things that I used to daydream about as a kid. Like, man, that'd be awesome. You know, it was one of those far-off, far-fetched video game daydreams that I used to have. Like, I don't know, Kratos jumping mythologies, you know, Final Mix coming out in America, a re-release of Final Fantasy XII, a completed Crash to Insanity, you know? And as time goes on, it seems like video game companies keep, you know, checking things off of that list, you know? You know, Kratos jumping mythologies, done. Final Fantasy XII re-release, done. Final Mix out in America, done. Crash to Insanity completed? Not so much. And now with the announcement of, you know, this new Crash Bandicoot game, that seems to be less likely than ever before. But I digress. Let's just take a minute so I can nerd out about this game. They went hard with this remake. They really, really did. And I'm not even necessarily talking about the graphics or the music or the combat or any of that. Those things are always good in Square games. I'm talking strictly about the little things. The minute Saturday morning sitting crisscross applesauce on the basement floor in front of your CRT details that Square had absolutely no reason to put in this game other than the fact that they knew those little things would be important to someone out there. Like, for example, when you find the guy in the marketplace in the bathroom clearly in distress, a part that really stuck out in my mind from the original game for some reason. It was poison, I tell ya. All the side quests where they fleshed out Johnny, you know, the random drunk guy from the original game, I honestly found really funny and charming.
We have? Hold up. What were we doing before all this?
The ratio of 1 to 10,000 on the scale model of Midgard.
In 1/10,000th scale.
The part where you gotta sneak out of Aerith's house.
Now get back in there.
Okay.
The tent with the gun that shoots at you. The old guy at the bar. The squat contest. Although, since that was a thing in Crisis Core, I suspected it'd be in this game too. And the staircase scene was absolutely great.
You have got to be shitting me.
Nope. We're a lot less likely to get caught this way.
But a lot more likely to die of boredom.
In the original game, it was this long and somewhat tedious affair that had a few funny lines thrown into the mix. But in the remake, they made this whole thing a full-fledged comedy. I mean, I was entertained the whole time.
Well, at least it ain't a race. Small blessing.
Everything about it, from Cloud's temper tantrums,
I'll keep an eye on Barrett.
to Barrett's frustration with the whole thing,
This sucks! I want to go back!
to the whole party gradually getting tired and slowing down as it goes on, the music phasing in and out like your characters are about to pass out. It was all just great. The payoff of seeing them all out of breath for about half a minute at the top of the stairs was so damn funny. I want this scene to go down as classic. I want this to be a running thing. I want there to be a part in future Final Fantasy games where you just run up a staircase and the party completes. Back when this game was just a rumor, I thought, okay, well, they're gonna have to rate it M, right? I mean, what with all the crazy alien mutants and blood and innuendo and cursing, if they're gonna put all that in this remake, they're gonna have to rate it M, right? So when I heard that it was getting rated T, 14, I was frankly a little concerned, And that was for two reasons. For one reason, like, a lot of Barrett's dialogue in the original game is censored with, all those silly, nonsensical characters that they use to censor curse words in cartoons and stuff. Usually they use those for curse words that are worse than shit. And that's what they did in the game. And so I'm thinking, okay, well, any curse word worse than shit in a game automatically gets you an M rating. I have yet to see an exception to that rule. Video games are not movies. So that was one thing. And then the other reason I was concerned was if it was gonna get, censored like that, it would have directly impacted what was probably my favorite scene in the original game. The Honeybee Inn arc was one of the most memorable parts of any Final Fantasy game to me when I was younger. The cross-dressing, the heavy sexual implications, the scene with the guys in the hot tub, and the grand creep himself, Don Corneo. You remember all that. So, when I heard this game was going to get rated T, I thought to myself, damn it, my favorite part of the game is going to get neutered, if it's even there at all. So imagine my surprise when, about halfway through the game, this happens.
Sweet here at the Honeybee, and every moment is a treat.
Welcome to the Honeybee Inn, Cloud.
This whole thing
You
made
seek
me
my
so
approval.
happy. I loved the opening musical number. I loved the swung synth pop big band show tune mashup. I loved the personality and energy of Andrea Rodea, as well as his dance number with Cloud. And I loved the build of energy up to that reveal of Cloud in the disguise. It just made me so happy. They made this one little scene in the original game this big special thing. I was sure this was going to get left out, and they did it so tastefully. Like, in this day and age, a modern version of this arc could easily have been really offensive, you know, kind of like how Ace Ventura hasn't aged that great, but I thought they did it really well. Andrea even makes a comment about his disregard of gender normativity roles.
True beauty is an expression of the heart. A thing without shame, to which notions of gender don't apply.
Absolutely amazing. But did they include my favorite line?
I'll cut him off.
No way.
I'll rip them off.
Oh my god.
Or I'll smash them.
Wow. But then the big things were magical too. I mean, all the broad strokes are there. All the classic moments from the original game. All those moments that you were hoping would be there, I promise, they're there. And even some further light gets shed on some moments that got glossed over, like what happened when Aerith went to 7th Heaven to rescue Marlene. And even the stuff that wasn't there in the original game was magical too. And there's too many of those magical moments to name. But think about the scene in the Hollow Room, when they're on the tour, and it flies the party out over this simulation of the world back when it was just the Ancients, and the aesthetic of it looks like something straight out of Final Fantasy IX, or one of the first 6. The airship even looks like one of the classic airships. And then, towards the end, when they show the city of the future, it looks like Final Fantasy XIII. Combined with this music that's sort of this big, elegant mashup of the Prelude theme and a heroic version of the Shinra theme.
Committed to changing and evolving with them. Like the ancients, we've harnessed the power of Mako. Are they out
I don't
there
know.
watching us?
There was just something really grand and magical about this whole scene. Like we were bearing witness to something transcending this reality. Almost like this scene really was playing with the idea of a shared universe of all Final Fantasy games. I don't know, it just really felt like we were looking into Ivalice, or Eden, or Alexandria at this part. And finally, there's the characters themselves, all lifted directly out of the original game in both appearance and personality. Heidegger is just as menacing and regal as you would have imagined.
Yes, there will be no delays.
Palmer appears toward the end, and the first thing he talks about is butter, which made me laugh so hard, because in the original game, his most memorable speech to me is that one where he's talking about how much butter and lard he wants in his tea.
Oh dear. A man of my refined taste running out of butter.
Corneo, in all his disgusting, lecherous glory, looks exactly how I imagined he would.
Don't be shy, little kitten. Shimmy on over and give Daddy some sugar.
Mayor Domino, who maintains his role as the proxy mayor hiding out in the library, is given a greater role as a secret double agent for Avalanche, with music that gives this scene a level of warmth I really wasn't expecting. And finally, Hojo. Goddamn Hojo.
Did you really think we'd leave such a precious specimen to rot in the gutter?
Has any introductory scene ever been more perfect? I mean, listen to the Genova chime playing faintly in the background.
If she had only trusted me instead of trying to run, it could have played out quite differently.
Hojo is one of my most hated Final Fantasy villains. I mean, seriously, he's just so creepy and invasive, you know? So demented. It's like there's nothing that he wouldn't do. You know, I mean, the only Final Fantasy villain that even, like, kind of comes close for me is Jill Nabat. And I know that these two villains compared with, you know, big bads like X-Death or Kefka, or even Sephiroth, the big bad of this game. You know, I know that compared to guys like that, the body count, the power level, the two things don't compare at all. But for me, the effect that these villains have personally on your characters throughout the game is just, it's unforgettable. That Genova motif was what did it for me. A big part of the greatness of Final Fantasy VII was the inclusion of a subplot about a super powerful, equally creepy alien who slammed into the planet years ago with the intent of devouring it, and whose appearance was responsible for the destruction of the world's original people. Genova was the real beginning of evil in Final Fantasy VII's universe, her cells also having given rise to Sephiroth, who destroyed everything and went crazy when he found out he was monster spawn in what came to be referred to as the Nibelheim incident, which has become the most iconic Sephiroth moment, and indeed one of the definitive moments of video game history. So it's like, on top of this insane plot involving magic, monsters, science fiction, kaiju, corporate greed, terrorism, environmentalism, and everything else you can think of, there's some cosmic horror thrown in for good measure. I remember playing the original game, and after you get captured, all the freaky stuff starts happening, and there's just blood and corpses all over the place, all leading up to the reveal that, guess what? There's an alien god, and it came to kill you all, and it's being cryogenically preserved by an insane scientist who's been using its cells for years to create super soldiers. There's just this whole aura of sickness and insanity and destruction and terror that surrounds Genova. And so when I first played the original game and her music kicked on out of nowhere and you're suddenly standing there fighting this enormous alien abomination, oh yeah, that was unforgettable. I will never forget about the final fight against Hojo in the original game, where he morphs into all these crazy alien forms. I cannot wait to see that part remastered. So at least for now, I'm done gushing. You know, I had a lot to say about this game. Way too much for just one video. And so for that reason, we're going to continue the discussion about this game next episode, where we're going to look at the real juicy stuff, the soundtrack, a little more in depth. But for now, to wrap this episode up, I want to talk about something that's going to be vitally important to that discussion. To preface, it's important to my explanation to understand a little bit about what I mean by the phrase video game iconography. It lends a lot of additional power and heft to long-running franchises like Mario or Zelda or this, for example. When I use this phrase, I'm talking about something that splits the difference between lore, Easter eggs, and straight-up nostalgia. It's the kind of thing that you look at or listen to, and when you do, you can feel the heft of decades of awesomeness behind it. Marvel movies, for example, play on this all the time. Disney movies sometimes do too. It can be something minor, like seeing Din, Faror, and Naryu symbols all over the place in Zelda games, or something more obvious, like seeing the Master Sword resting in the glade. Iconography is something that companies work hard to build up over years and years, and so developers like Nintendo that put out games with lots of this stuff could be said to have an unfair advantage, but the thing is, they earned it. Example, you say? Well, boy, do I have a great one. And the thing that makes this example great is that it has to do with the narrative structure of the game itself. The composers for this game surely knew that a lot of people playing this game, myself included, would already know every song in it by heart, note for note, harmony for harmony. So they throw your ear for a loop, or 2, or 10. When the game starts up, even in the opening, they hint at this. You hear the slow strings on the E, and of course, you know the opening melody is coming, but it's delayed with some new musical material, which reflects the game itself. It's the game you remember, with some new thematic material interspersed. And they drag the tension out longer and longer, way longer than the original version. And it makes sense, and you feel it, because you, as this person who's played the original game, you know what's coming. You're ready to be punched right in the gut by the full orchestra singing this opening theme at the apex of the build. And oh man, did I get punched. That's the power of iconography.
Speaking of this opening fanfare, there's something interesting that they do with it later on. There's a scene in the game where this motif returns. And I thought this was beyond interesting because, to my knowledge, this is the first time in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII that this motif has been heard outside of the opening. It's never been used as thematic material before, but the idea of it appearing here is really cool because, spoiler alert, this remake is not exactly, well, exact. All the broad strokes of the original story are there, but there are some additions here and there, not the least of which are these phantoms which seem to be intent on screwing with pivotal events in the timeline. So the idea of Aerith becoming attuned to this, in conjunction with the music, gives this scene the feeling of bearing witness to forces outside of the plot of the game itself.
Is something wrong?
It's nothing.
Okay, so I'm gonna do my best to explain exactly why this is cool. The fact that this is a remake is actually the main crux of this game. This is a timeline seemingly different in a few ways from the one we're familiar with in the original game, and the purpose of these ghosts is basically to show up and make it into the one we remember. And I eventually caught on to this myself, before Red 13 explained it at the end of the game.
They are drawn to those who attempt to alter destiny's course and ensure they do not.
They tried with Wedge and seemingly failed. Who would have thought that Wedge would be the thing that would slip through the cracks of the space-time continuum and end up alive when he really should have been dead? I know that the reception of these phantoms has been mixed, but I gotta say, I really like the concept here. It's like what they tried to do with Final Fantasy XIII too, except it makes more sense here. I also felt vindicated at the end of the game when this motif comes back as the phantoms go haywire.
Freedom. Boundless, terrifying freedom.
I guess because some kind of confluence of fate and Sephiroth or one of his clones, if we're following the events of the original game, cuts a swath in space-time. But anyways, the atmosphere I felt at that scene with Aerith was accurate. The game really was hinting at the idea of forces bigger than the timeline itself. And in choosing an opening fanfare which has for years simply been the calling card of the game itself, rather than the motivic material representing a character or plot element, perfectly conveyed that yes, Aerith is sensing something beyond the pale. It does transcend the game itself, and you, the veteran, being familiar with the original timeline, end up becoming something akin to a Marvel watcher. You watch events unfold, you watch characters fight so hard and care so much, all the while possessing the grim knowledge of the ultimate fate of the characters and the world itself. And the fact that this could be hinted at so clearly, with the use of just this one little theme for 5 seconds during the game, is awesome. That's iconography at its best. Functionally, it makes sense too, because it's like you, as the veteran, aren't expecting any surprises with this story. For example, when I reached the final act, spoiler alert, I was like, okay, we'll get up there, President Shinra will have Sephiroth's sword in his back, we'll fight Rufus, escape on the bike, and it'll all be cool. Well, those things did happen, in addition to about 50 other things. Barrett dies. Yeah, he dies. And I remember thinking, how ironic, because there's a line in the game where he talks about he, as the, quote, leading man, is guaranteed to survive.
Damn right. Leading man sticks around to the credits roll!
Aside from him not being the leading man at all, I was like, well, we all know he's going to survive. And everyone, including people who have never touched a Final Fantasy game in their lives, know who's slated for death. So to see him get 86th along with President Shinra was actually a genuine surprise. But yeah, bottom line, I like the Phantoms. I like that they screw with this alternate timeline to turn it into the one you know rather than vice versa. And I like this use of the overture. And plus, doesn't it just fit? Hasn't it always sounded mysterious and ethereal? And while I'm on the subject, I want to say my piece about the endgame. Yeah, there's no reason not to. This is going to be spoiler heavy, so if that's something you care about, fair warning. That being said, when I beat this game, the first thing I wondered was how people who aren't familiar with the original game felt about this one. At several points, like these visions the gang has towards the end about pivotal events in the original timeline, like the Black Materia summoning Meteor and Aerith's death, something that was foreshadowed again with the music when Cloud and Sephiroth faced off at the Nexus of Creation.
Careful now.
I was like, okay, the iconography works with me here because I've played the original game. So I know that Meteor is an apocalyptic attack summoned by Sephiroth, but like, there's no context. It's like the part where Kite Sith sees the destruction and wallows over it. If you didn't know who that was, you'd be like, what the hell is that thing? As for the fights themselves, well, most of them caught me off guard. A lot of Square games do this thing where you fight 1,000,000 bosses in a row at the end of the game. Sometimes it's one boss that goes through a bunch of forms, and sometimes it's several independent bosses you just happen to fight in a row. But most of the time, it's a combination of both. I kid you not, once you get to that Genova fight, you better strap in because you're in for about 2 more hours of fighting. It's almost like Square Enix knows how ridiculous their endgame sequences are, and ups the ante each time, almost like an inside joke. I was shocked to fight Genova, because if you recall, you don't fight her during the first Midgar arc of the original game. But the fight was still welcome, especially for the music. And then you fight Rufus, like you'd expect. Then you fight the tank monstrosity, like you'd expect, although not on the elevator. Then you fight another tank monstrosity on the bike, also like you'd expect. And this is where you think things are over. But no, they're just getting started. The Phantoms show up, presumably trying to prevent you from changing the timeline, even though most of these events match up 1-to-1 with the original game, so who knows why they're coming out of the woodwork now, probably to drag Wedge back to hell. And you go through the rift, where you fight the Arbiter of Fate and, I guess, change destiny. Okay, well, that's all well and good, except now, you gotta fight Sephiroth. What? Why? Okay, well, this is a surprise. I know that Cloud and Sephiroth fighting is an iconic thing, and basically the axis of the Final Fantasy VII franchise. But why? Why in this game? Well, this version of One-Winged Angel is pretty awesome.
It's on you.
Here goes!
And this Sephiroth fight, jeez. I kid you not, they gave him his entire movesets from both Dissidia and Kingdom Hearts. 2 movesets that worked me over when I was a kid. God damn. So you beat him, and Cloud looks out at the edge of creation at the nebula, probably portals to all the other Final Fantasy games, and he comes back and... What?
Hey, Cloud. Did you see that?
Okay, so I guess you beating the Arbiter of Fate resulted in some of that terrible shit that happened not happening, which means that at least Biggs, and more importantly, Zack Fair himself, the man whose sacrifice turned Cloud into who he is, survived the horrible events that killed them. They show that for Zack, that means he successfully destroyed the military, but for Biggs, does that mean the Sector 7 pillar never fell? When the sparkles fall over the rebuilding sector and the camera pans away, does the whole region turn back how it was? It's an ambiguous ending, it's convoluted, I can see how it would leave a bad taste in some people's mouths. But honestly, I think it's cool, at least for me. I like how it's predicated on the understanding that you, as the veteran, know how things are supposed to happen. And so you're coming at the timeline from the same perspective as the ghosts. It's almost like the characters in this remake are fighting not to be a remake. So when you see these visions and you see Zack survive, these things mean something to you. They mean a lot to you, especially if you were someone who played Crisis Core. Seeing a version of the story where Zack actually survives made me genuinely feel warm inside. But what about people who haven't played these games? It's almost less like Final Fantasy VII Remake and more like Final Fantasy VII What If.
The beauty of this is that this is only one example. This whole soundtrack is positively wicked, both in what it does and how it sounds. But that's a discussion best left for another time. So I'll see you guys for part 2, and come back next time and we'll get into the insanity that is this soundtrack.